Now here's something I've wanted to get to for a long time. If you want to discuss the epitome of nostalgia, it's 2010 and 2011. In that time, I was getting into YouTube game reviews from a bunch of different people, but it was also in this time that I was learning more about the history of video games and their evolution as I was discovering retro games and playing them for myself. A series that had me hooked from start to finish was Gexup's Naughty Dog vs. Insomniac Games. Seeing Johnny talk about Sonic and then teaching me about games like Metroid and Mario was cool, but seeing YouTubers who tackled the more niche 2000s stuff I liked, unheard of. To cut to the chase, I've decided I'm going to do a modern day, rebooted version of that series. Crash Bandicoot vs. Spyro the Dragon and Jak and Daxter vs. Ratchet and Clank. This gives me an interesting way to tackle these games that have been talked into the ground before, but my perspective is a bit unique. I grew up in the 6th generation, however, I also played Crash 1 and 2 a lot on my PS2. But I've been well aware of the Spyro games for most of my life, but I've just never bothered sitting down and finishing one of them. Until now. So I'll finally get an excuse to put Crash Bandicoot under the critical microscope, and I'll also be able to play and have perspective on Spyro the Dragon. But above all else, the first season of Jay's reviews from 2015 and 16 consisted of reviews in the original Sly trilogy, all 6 Jak games, and the Ratchet series from 1 to Size Matters. I later redid the Sly trilogy, and let's be honest, I might have to do those cringy videos over again someday, but at least Jay's Review Seasons 2 and 3 got to reevaluate the Sly trilogy. But the same could not be said for Ratchet and Jak, and this idea gives me the ability to finally have really good videos discussing my thoughts on these games while adding the versus battle twist, instead of it just being Jak 3 re-review, Jak X redone, Size Matters still sucks, etc. Anywhooter, Crash Bandicoot 1 is a really nostalgic game for me. Not because I grew up playing it ever since I got it in 2006, but really because the history of this one just gives me a nostalgic feeling. Now, here on Jay's Reviews, we don't spend time talking about shit everybody already knows about, like the Sonic's ass game, but I mean, the early 5th gen is such an exciting time. I mean, think about it. Games were making this massive transition from the tried and true 2D gameplay that had been getting better and better for the last 20 years into the scary unknown world of 3D, as Sony was bursting onto the scene with the PlayStation, the biggest and baddest competition yet, a rival created by Nintendo in the previous generation, which is, again, not the story I'm going to tell tonight, but now there is a new mascot to go along with the console directly competing with Mario and Sonic. If that wasn't enough to get you excited, just look at the accolades in the back of the box. The best action platform game I've ever seen or played. From Die Hard Game Fan. Now, if you aren't going to listen to Die Hard Game Fan, I don't know who you trust for your game recommendations, because you don't mess with Die Hard Game Fan. The holiday season of 1996, it was Crash Bandicoot in the PlayStation versus Mario 64 and the Nintendo 64. Like, that's just awesome to think about, as this was the last era where the console wars thing was cool. And not a thing for absolute losers on Facebook fan pages to fight over. And the poor Sega kids were left with the cancelled Sonic Extreme and a port of Sonic 3D Blast. But I'll get to that game another day. Now let's fast forward 2 years. The 5th gen hardware was going strong, Crash Bandicoot was at his 3rd game, while Insomniac Games, the up-and-coming developer, tossed their hat into the mascot platform ring with Spyro the Dragon, basically taking the place of Crash Bandicoot as the PS1 mascot, as Crash would venture off into spin-off territory for the remainder of the generation. By the way, both Naughty Dog and Insomniac had made games prior to Crash and Spyro, but I just don't care. Moving on, comparing Crash 1 and Spyro 1 might be a bit unfair, given Crash 1's status as a launch title, and Spyro releasing when Crash 3 was out, but hey, we gotta get the ball rolling somewhere, don't we? In both of these games, the story is little more than an excuse to get the game started. Crash especially, since in that game, you wouldn't even know what the story was if you didn't read the manual or wait on the title screen for a cutscene to appear. And even then, I have no idea what's even going on in this cutscene. Like, Dr. Neo Cortex is experimenting on anthros in this thing called the Cortex Vortex, but Crash escapes, and that's that.
Capture him! Uh-oh! Prepare the female panda.
Like, that was such a bizarrely fast-paced cutscene that I laughed when I saw it in this playthrough. Crash's girlfriend, how he has a girlfriend, I have no idea. Tawna being kidnapped is also only something you'd know if you saw this hidden scene, because in the actual game, she's just sitting in these bonus stages, eager to save your progress. As you progress to Cortex's lair, the lab magically sets itself on fire, Cortex is beaten, and the game is over. But I can't completely dump on this nonsense, because Crash 1 does have a lot of atmosphere and build-up. Like, the jungle environments are really relaxing and atmospheric, as are most locations in Crash 1. Similar to Sonic 1, you start Crash in mostly natural areas, progressing more towards Cortex's base with levels like Heavy Machinery and Cortex Power, as the 3rd island is clearly in the distance of stages like the Lost City, and Cortex's face is clearly seen throughout the game, which for 1996 is a job well done, I'd say. but the non-existent story is just absolute madness. By comparison, the story of Spyro 1 is pretty decent. These dragons are being interviewed until they bash Nasty Gnorc, Gnasty Gnorc as it's spelled. Nasty is watching this and is so triggered that he doesn't just block them on Twitter, he just turns them into stone, and Spyro's somehow not affected by this due to his size, leaving it up to him to free the rest of the dragons. Actually, this plot is still nonsense, but luckily in a game where the plot is completely irrelevant, I can just skip these dragon conversations and move on with the game, safely missing nothing, and Crash 1 doesn't even have cutscenes outside of the 1, so it's a non-issue. Looking at the presentation, both of these games are quite impressive. Spyro 1, in a day where facial animation on PS1 was still not something you saw very often, is pretty good for 1998 standards, although again, nothing that is said in this game is particularly worthwhile. Crash 1 is the beginning of Naughty Dog's prestige as industry leaders when it comes to presentation. Crash 1's loading screens are really short, all the while the full areas are loaded at once. It's amazing that games that came out after this couldn't capture the same effect. Crash 1 only ever loads what you're looking at on the screen, which plays into the game's lack of camera control. This has an effect on the gameplay, of course, but if we're just talking about the game design technique, that is pretty great. It's not a fair comparison since Crash 1 is a linear game and Spyro 1's an open exploration game, but I'd give the visuals debate to Crash Bandicoot, no doubt. Spyro's environments look good and varied, but the game does suffer a bit from graphic pop-up as the draw distance is good for 1998, but still something you'd notice when playing in 2020 that isn't really a factor in Crash 1. Sonically, both these games set the tone for their franchises, but neither soundtrack is what I'd describe as an earworm. The title screen themes are catchy. However, in the game, I find that both OSTs go for more atmosphere than anything else. But what I like about both is that their respective composers, Josh Mansell and Stuart Copeland, produce this distinct sound that instantly gets you to think of Crash Bandicoot or Spyro the Dragon. Spyro especially, as most if not all tracks in the trilogy just have this mystical, fairy tale, dreamlike tone that always feels right at home. But that just leaves us with the gameplay, and honestly, I was actually hoping this topic would make for a more exciting video than the one we have ahead of us, because Crash Bandicoot is a game I've been playing for the last 14 years. I think it's good, with flaws, and Spyro 1 is a game I'm happy to finally cross off my backlog, but other than that, I just thought it was an okay game. I will say this though, Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon are two games that when compared do say something about the tastes of the person comparing them. It's the positive inverse dichotomy to the one I raised way back in the X6 versus X7 days. What's worse, a boring game or a frustrating game? In this case, I thought Spyro the Dragon was a much more polished experience than Crash Bandicoot, having hindsight on its side, but I just felt more invested in my playthrough of Crash 1 even if its flaws count as higher. The age-old debate, what matters more, your individual experience with a game, its challenge and world, or a game's polish? I don't think there's a right answer to that question, it's just what you prefer. Now, my ideal game is one that has the best of both worlds, but if I were to choose between a game that's incredibly polished or a game that's rough around the edges but more memorable, I'd take the latter in most cases, but it does depend on just how rough those edges are. It's why I prefer Sonic Adventure any day over Sonic Lost World, or Sonic CD any day over Sonic Mania. This is why there are a few Nintendo franchises that really do a lot for me. What I think both of these games do really well is the simplicity of the controls. I think the 5th generation of hardware was the last time when most games were very easy to pick up and play. Like, 21st century games have too many complex systems to hand to your grandparents and expect them to perform. Now, older games weren't easy by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm saying that Super Mario Bros. 1 is a game that anybody could learn how to play within like a minute. Crash 1's whole design just feels like a 5th gen equivalent of Super Mario Bros., as the objective is just to get Crash from one side of the screen to the other. It's a 3D game from a camera perspective only. Not remotely an issue, mind you. I think it makes a lot of sense to just rely on design mentalities that became standard in the 3rd and 4th generations while getting to grips with designing full games out of polygons. Point is, Crash 1 is just arcade-like fun to me. Crash's moveset is really basic. X, and yes, I will always call it the X button, is how you jump, square activates Crash's spin attack, his only offensive capability, and since the DualShock was not invented yet, the D-pad is how you move around, another reason why making really linear stages works well. And that's really it. Crash can't do anything else as a character, the game is built on the back of its level design. Spyro as well has a very simple moveset which I like, but it's more complex than Crash as Spyro can run around, utilizing the analog stick as the DualShock was around by this point. He can breathe fire, charge into enemies with his horns, glide with his wings, dive into the charge from the air, dodge, and rotate the camera around. I really like how the game takes advantage of its two attacks by having enemies that need to be burned to be defeated and enemies that need to be rammed into, with clear tells as to which is which. While both of these anthropomorphic mascots are simple to control, that's where the similarities do end. Crash Bandicoot is a platformer that requires you to go from level to level, overcoming the vast amount of platforming obstacles and enemies that are in your way. This is Crash's greatest strength. Every time I revisit this game, I always find myself impressed with how intuitive the level design feels to go through. For starters, the game does an excellent job with tutorialization, gradually exposing you to different challenges, then combining them to test what you've learned. With such simple platforming that is so well telegraphed, every death in Crash 1 is understandable. By that I mean, I don't think there will be a time in the main stages where you'll die not knowing why you died like we were playing Mega Man X6 or something. The platforms are all moving in patterns, as are the enemies. If you fail to read these things correctly, you die and you try again. That's where the arcade fun aspect of the game comes in, as mastering this level design feels very satisfying. That's not to say the game is easy, though. Expect that to happen a lot, because this game is pretty challenging. But again, I think it's fair at the same time. Sometimes I have the inclination to try and rush through the stages and this will just get you killed. Spyro, on the other hand, is a game that's built upon a formula I don't really care for. Outside of Jak and Daxter, the precursor legacy, I can't really name a collectathon-like game I have found remotely engaging to play. I don't know what that particular game does for me that others don't, but we can explore that when we get to that game. Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, all those games, they just don't do anything for me, and Spyro is much the same. The objective of each area is to free the frozen dragons from their statue forms, and you also collect gems. The act of collecting things just isn't fun to me. I do like how Spyro requires different collectibles to move from world to world, like dragons in this world and gems in the next. That was pretty interesting as a cut down on backtracking in the early parts of the game especially. However, this returns to what I was saying before. Spyro 1 is a very well made and polished game, but it's a gameplay loop that doesn't offer me much reward for playing it. Like, it plays well, it looks good, is advanced for its time, has a diverse amount of content, and will keep you busy if you're the type to get into the explorative type games, but that's just not my kind of playstyle. It's much more about the action of video games with some interesting exceptions. It's for that reason that I can say I prefer Crash 1 over Spyro 1 when Crash suffers from blatant issues that Spyro doesn't, like the control. Crash may be simple to handle, but he's also really janky to play as at the same time. There aren't really that many languages I can put this in. Crash just feels like he has cement strapped to his feet with every jump and every turn. Simply put, I think Crash's levels are very well designed, but I think he's a clunky character to actually play as. This doesn't bother me that much when playing the game normally, as Crash gives players tons of chances, as you get drowned in lives over the course of your playthrough, but it's once you try to complete the game when everything goes down the drain. Completing Spyro 1 is just more of the same as playing it normally, just free all the dragons, get all the gems, and get all the dragon eggs. But for Crash, good lord, this is just pure torture. In every stage there are numerous boxes to break, which is where Crash got his name from. He's a Bandicoot that crashes into boxes. Boom, Crash Bandicoot. To fully complete the game, you need to finish every stage and also destroy each box in every area. Now, finding them all is easy enough since the levels are so straightforward, which would lead you to think that this would be a pretty simple 100% quest, and it is in theory. In practice, it's the exact opposite. This is because there is no room for error whatsoever. If you so much as die, you need to go back to the stage select and start over, because all your boxes are lost when dying. Even if you go back and break them all again, the game just doesn't count that. It has to be done in one go, no exceptions. This is punishing, but the control kills it. I can accept the controls when just playing the game normally, but with this no room for error crap, I am done. You'll die all the time from things you probably wouldn't pay much mind in a normal run, but it's now soul crushing as all your progress is just reduced to ash. It was so frustrating that I quit by the Lost City. I didn't even get to the worst stages like Sunset Vista or Heavy Machinery, these stages where the camera goes from a cool game design trick to a nightmare, as you have to backtrack through these stages and I can barely see what's coming. And it's a quest that is worth absolutely nothing because all that happens is that non-canon good ending where Crash just skips the final boss fight and pieces out. Like, what? But I guess that's something to talk about. The bosses in Crash 1 all rely on very simple patterns, which makes them very easy to deal with, but there is pattern recognition to get down with at the very least. Spyro's offerings in the boss departments are incredibly lame. You just sort of light them on fire and that's basically it. With the final boss being the greatest anti-climax of all. It's not even a fight, just a repetitive chase scene, as dying forces you to recollect the keys that start the boss fight. I hope the sequels improve this here, because it makes the stuff in Crash look really good by comparison. Like I said earlier, I was kind of hoping for a more exciting video to come out of this topic, but it is what it is. As you can probably tell, Spyro 1 is a game that I think is good, but I wasn't very interested in it at any point during my playthrough, as collectathons always feel like going through the motions, like busy work to me. Now, does my having played Crash since age 5 versus not having played Spyro until age 19 have something to do with the final verdict? Maybe, but I certainly don't hold Crash anywhere near as fondly as Sly Cooper or Sonic the Hedgehog. It's definitely the kind of nostalgia that can be beaten. Especially in a game like Crash that has a simple appeal but numerous flaws, leave me to say. Crash is fun, but the game definitely doesn't hold up to 2020 standards. But Naughty Dog was certainly just getting started with Crash, as I can already tell you that I love Crash 2 and Crash 3 to death. Even if they aren't the kinds of games you'd see me race home to play or talk that much about, but still. I hope I like Spyro games going forward, because I've tried to get into the series before, but it just never grabbed me in this first installment. I was hoping Spyro 1 would win this first episode, since that would mean that Crash wouldn't just win every round, but I'm not gonna lie to you guys either. But hey, maybe Spyro 2 and Spyro 3 will impress me, and hopefully there's more room for interesting discussion there. But regardless, that is all I have to say for today, so thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.